Hi, everyone. Judge Andrew Napolitano here for Judging Freedom. Today is Thursday, November 2nd, 2023. Colonel Douglas Macgregor joins us. Colonel, always a pleasure. Thank you for your time and your insight. Is the Israeli government running out of time to save itself from the consequences of a massive ground invasion in Gaza?
Well, I think it's certainly headed in that direction. I don't know if it already has. We have to listen to what the Russian ambassador had to say in the United Nations, as well as other leaders in the region. We have to note the recent meeting between the foreign ministers of Turkey and Iran, and then the conversations between the Iranian foreign minister, Mr. Erdogan. All of these things have an ominous tone about them. That doesn't mean that everything is about to fall on Israel immediately, but I think we're headed in that direction, and it doesn't appear that anyone in Washington is interested in halting the rush into disaster.
Was one of Hamas's goals on October 7th to induce an Israeli overreaction so as to coalesce Arab animosity in the region against it?
Well, it's not unreasonable to make that point, but we haven't talked to anyone in Hamas. We don't know what their thinking happens to be, but if that wasn't their intention, it certainly turned out to be that way.
Is the Israeli military walking into a trap by attempting to wage a land war in a place as treacherous, as urban, as filled with tunnels and old buildings as Gaza is?
I think so. I would say on many levels. If we go back to the summer of last year, when the war in Ukraine was changing or evolving, and the world's eyes were fixed almost exclusively on what was happening there, had the Israelis confronted Hamas at that point, I think the Israelis would have had an easier time waging this sort of ruthless, scorched earth campaign against Hamas than they have right now. It's simply a function of the fact that the world is not looking at Ukraine because the world knows the truth. The war in Ukraine is effectively over. The losses and the destruction in Ukraine are horrendous. Ukrainians can't do much about it. So everyone is focused now on Israel and Hamas, and they're seeing things that upset them. You cannot broadcast the pictures of dead children being carried out of the rubble in Gaza without expecting some sort of horrendous national reaction out of each of the Arab states and from the so-called Arab street. So that's definitely part of it. And on another level, I think that the region is increasingly coalescing into this alliance that might have otherwise never occurred. There's a readiness to take action. There's no doubt about it against the Israelis. And we, again, are the loyal, obedient servants of Mr. Netanyahu and his government.
The loyal, obedient servants of Mr. Netanyahu and his government. I'm sure that that's the way he feels. And of course, that is the way we behave. Back to Erdogan. Are his rantings and ravings before 1 million people, whatever the size of that crowd was, to be taken as for domestic political purposes or in preparation for support for military activity?
Both. There's no question about it. I think both are accurate. Mr. Erdogan is a clever, manipulative politician, if ever there was one, but he's also a very powerful nationalist in the Turkish sense and widely respected inside his country, if for nothing else, his strength in leading Turkey. In fact, you could say that in many ways, he's regarded by many of the Turks in this sense as a strong leader, the way many Israelis regarded Mr. Netanyahu. So I think he's deadly serious. And for the Turks to hold these meetings with the Iranians in public, they've always had meetings privately from time to time, but for these meetings to be so public is a very, very important signal to the world.
Why do you think that Prime Minister Netanyahu doesn't take note of this, or if he takes note of it, isn't acting upon it. I mean, my view is that his situation politically at home is so precarious, he only stays in office for as long as the war is being waged. And the minute the war is over, he's out of office and maybe out of freedom. But I would think if Iran and Turkey are cooking something up, and with Erdogan riling up the masses, Netanyahu ought to take note of it and perhaps do something like pull the troops back or let humanitarian aid in. So my question is, if there's a ceasefire, who wins, or who's perceived as winning?
You know, I don't know that there will be any winners if there is an immediate ceasefire. In other words, something happens right away. It'll take time to sort out, but I think whatever happens will work to Israel's disadvantage strategically. And I think Mr. Netanyahu, and by the way, I haven't met him. I don't know him. I've read other people's assessments, but I can't evaluate him personally. But I think that he is a ferocious fighter for Israel. There's no question about that. But I also think he's got us in a position where I think he believes this is the time to leverage American national power to try and settle accounts, if he can do it, with his neighbors. And he is focused on that almost to the exclusion of everything else. We are giving him unconditional support on the assumption that he is going to be successful, that he will go in, root out Hamas, destroy the place, and that he can get that done before anything else happens. And we put our forces there as a stopgap measure in the event that Hezbollah attacks. I think it will. I don't know what the timing it will be, but I think they ultimately will do that so that we can distract Hezbollah from interfering with what Mr. Netanyahu is trying to do further south. And I think that's it. I think that's all there is right now. And many Israelis have complained that they don't see any other strategic end state other than Hamas is destroyed and Gaza is in ruins. And that's not by the way, that's not the kind of strategic end state that you want unless you want another war. That's the problem.
Here's Prime Minister Netanyahu, cut two, Chris, saying that Israel will never agree to a ceasefire.
I want to make clear Israel's position regarding a ceasefire. Just as the United States would not agree to a ceasefire after the bombing of Pearl Harbor or after the terrorist attack of 9/11, Israel will not agree to a cessation of hostilities with Hamas after the horrific attacks of October 7th. Calls for a ceasefire are calls for Israel to surrender to Hamas, to surrender to terrorism, to surrender to barbarism. That will not happen.
To me, that is just demagoguery. They could stop fighting for 48 hours and let water and food and fuel and medical supplies in.
Well, I think that's true, but there's something else here. We're hearing these constant references to the Second World War. And yes, we destroyed Germany. Yes, we destroyed Japan. And the result was a 50-year Cold War with the Soviet Union because we had to spend the money and raise the forces to fill the vacuums that we created on the strategic level with the destruction of both Japan and Germany. There were voices in the British General Staff, voices in our own, that warned there is a reason why Japan should survive. There are reasons why the Germans need to survive.
Right.
We don't want Hitler. We don't like the militarists in Japan. But these two states have an important role to play in Eurasia, on the periphery of Eurasia. Don't destroy them or we'll end up holding the bag. Well, guess what? That's exactly what happened. Now, Mr. Netanyahu is taking these things and he really wants us to help him do to his enemies in the region what we did to Japan, even if